So we're actually right on time, I think. So my name is Charlize Kagaanen. I'm a program director in the Division of Cancer Control and Population Sciences, and I'm also one of the organizers. Oh, sorry. Can everybody hear me now? I'm short enough, so I should be able to be right at the microphone. So I'm going to be moderating the session 3, which we've called Risks and Benefits to Individuals and Communities, and we're really hoping that this will be the session where we'll expand on a lot of the ideas that we've already introduced this morning. So just some housekeeping notes. We're going to have 2 speakers, and then we're going to take a break, and then everybody's going to come back, and we're going to have another couple of speakers before we have our panel. So let's get started with our first speaker, who is Greg Hampikian. Hopefully I got your name right, from Boise State University and also the Idaho Innocence Project. So Greg, come on up. And we're not going to have the panelists sit here now because of that break, but we'll invite everybody back later. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Thank you very much to the organizers. Is this one on? It's a great honor to be speaking here, and it's only my second time on this campus, and I'm just as blown away this time as the first time. I'm going to talk about some privacy issues, some possible solutions, and I'll start with work that I've done primarily through the Idaho Innocence Project on criminal matters, mostly post-conviction matters where people write to me and say they're innocent. And we use advanced DNA technology and good old gumshoe knocking on doors and interviewing witnesses to determine if they're innocent or not, and then if they are innocent, try to get them out of prison. So here's a couple of examples of how we have used genetic data, and I'm starting this talk out with the criminal side of things, but we'll get to the health side of things by contrast, I hope. And so in criminal matters, there's often a diminished expectation of privacy that patients in medical settings don't have. So here's an example of one of the cases that I worked on in Montana. Last year, we were able to free 2 men who had been in prison for 23 years for a murder, and we identified, with the help of the lab in Montana, a new suspect who was in prison for a similar crime, killing a woman with a blunt instrument to the head, and he matched the DNA on some of the evidence. Now, in order to do this, we had to use a convicted offender database. The police had access to that. We pushed for the DNA profile for evidence, and they were able to identify the new suspect. And that's because convicted felons have what the law says is a diminished expectation of privacy. Their DNA is available to law enforcement for searching. Here's a second case. This is Christopher Tapp. On the right here, this is just hours before he was freed. Myself and Jennifer Cummings from the Idaho Innocence Project getting to talk to him before he went into the courtroom. In that case, we helped the Idaho Falls Police Department use publicly available Y chromosome databases to try to find the last name of some semen that was left on a woman who had been assaulted and murdered. And it hadn't been done successfully at that point by anyone. Here's a small police department in Idaho working with, an innocence project at Boise State University, and we were able to get to a last name. Ussery was the last name. And now this lineage, of course, goes back a long time. The genealogy that now has been done by C.C. Moore goes back more than 200 years. But we were pretty sure that we were within 5 or 6 generations of a target. Chris was freed before we were able to complete this work. But what happened was the Idaho Falls Police Department was able to identify a person named Ussery because his father had given DNA to Ancestry.com, and Ancestry.com responded to a subpoena from the Idaho Falls Police Department, turned over their database, And the police were able to find out the man had a son who was in the area around the time of the murder, and made a movie called Murderobelia, which is, just a side note. But the police decided to detain him with a warrant to get DNA. He was excluded, just like his father, one mutation away. But we knew we were close. We were in the right family. And then C.C. Moore and Parabon, who did more work with the DNA, and really it was the paper genealogy that closed this case, were able to find out there was a man whose father is named Ussery, who, as a child, was not given his father's name, and his name is Brian Drips. He matches the DNA and is now a new suspect in that murder. So that just happened this year. Okay. Now, there again is a diminished expectation of privacy. In the first case, it was done through the courts. There was a court-ordered warrant of detention for Mr. Ussery, for the police to file that last name, and, of course, this criminal apprehension, this arrest, was also done through the courts. Now let's move on to medicine, the topic that we're here for. And while a criminal might have a diminished expectation of privacy, I think we would all agree that patients shouldn't. And in order to demonstrate that, I've pulled something from literary history. I hope no one will mind. I've abridged a John Donne poem that now is badly dated in many ways, but I think it gives us the point. There's John. It was a poem he wrote during his pre-religious time. He was trying to seduce a woman, and he's encouraging her to expose herself to him. And he says, "Come, madam, come, all rest. My powers defy. Until I labor, I in labor lie." So he starts with this medical metaphor that's going to continue throughout, and he ends it with, "Then since that I may know, as liberally as to a midwife, show thyself. Cast all, yea, this white linen hence. There is no penance due to innocence." And the reason I use this poem is because it shows us the long history of intimate trust that medicine is cherished for, and that patients actually expect, and they sign things about HIPAA and such. But let's look at that consent. In the poem, as in the NIH guidelines, it is not in perpetuity. If he gets her permission tonight, it doesn't mean he has permission tomorrow night. It is limited to specific uses. It's updated if there's a new risk, if he introduces a new risk. It's not transferable to his friends, an entity. It cannot be sold to a company. Privacy is assumed in this setting, and this permission can be easily and instantly revoked. All right, now let's look at some great examples from the medical field. So Vanderbilt University, I went to a talk at the Pacific Biocomputing Symposium a few years back, and whoever was in charge of their consent process gave a great talk of how they got 100,000 genetic profiles. Can't remember what year this was, but more than 5 years ago. And in talk afterwards, myself and some folks were talking to the speaker behind the podium, and we realized that this was a opt-out system. You were automatically enrolled. Your bandages, your blood, your tampon, whatever it is you leave in a hospital, they had permission to, unless you signed on page 3, this is their intake form, I'll skip page 2, "Do not use my leftover blood for the DNA data bank." Now, only the really, crappiest apps on the internet are these opt-out. Any respectable group has an opt-in program, and it should be clearly labeled. Imagine a patient or someone caring for a patient going to Vanderbilt University Hospital and asking, "Do I have to fill this out on page 3?" And they're told no. Is this what NIH meant by informed consent? Is this what any of our conventions mean by informed consent? And so here's some NIH stuff I pulled from the website. that you have permission to continue participating in research. These are all for potential research subjects. This all should be explained to them. It's all about respect for the enrolled participant. The word respect I've highlighted a few times on here. You have to let them know the risks and benefits, but you should also explain to them that their interest may or may not match the research study. It's a pretty involved discussion. For my own work in forensics, there are exceptions to HIPAA. The BTK killer was a killer who was identified, I believe, through the pap smear of his daughter at a university. So there are exceptions to HIPAA for police, and there's a number of other exceptions. And so I don't know if these are the current ones, but there are people in the audience who can answer that, I'm sure. Okay. So California, the last time I attended the Pacific Symposium on Biocomputing last year, there was a speaker talking about how their hospitals are doing research using hospital records. They've developed a united system to share these. But I just went through the history of this. You know, the California schools were trying to get all the freshmen to give them DNA, and then they backed off of that. They will not send students the results, and then they decided not to take it. But what I found out in 2019 is they are taking medical records from people in the university hospital systems and doing what they call operational optimization. What is that? Well, it looks like research. It was presented as research. I mean, I've been in research for, a few decades. It looked like research to me, but it's obviously skirting around any sort of IRB or specific research initiatives. And I questioned the speaker, who I respect a great deal, about this because I think it's disingenuous. What is it? Non-research research? Fake research, like fake news? I mean, this is insidious. These are medical practitioners. These are the people to whom John Donne compared himself when he wanted to see someone naked. And if you look at the history of the California system, these are just things I pulled from the web, they did all of the footwork that we think people should do to prepare a community to give up their personal information, including in this document I found on the web from 2013 as they were trying to develop their biobank. They talk about the case of Henrietta Lacks. And then, in a sense, they turned us all into her if you're treated in one of their hospitals. And I don't want to say this is bad, this research is bad. I just want to say it is uninformed. It is not consensual. And, listening to some feminist scholars recently and realizing that consent is meaningless when you're talking about an incredible power differential. If someone owns a dam and we're standing in front of it and they hold the key to the dam and I have a cup of water, really I can't consent to anything. Force is implied by the potential of the force. And so coming into a hospital when you are sick or you're caring for someone who's sick, you don't have the ability to consent in a normal way. It is not a contractual system where there is consideration for both parties. So California continues to lead the way in terms of at least news coverage of this. I'm not an expert in privacy. These are things that I could find, in a few days' research. They're taking their blood from newborn heels, and they are sequencing the genomes of any of the children who turn positive without permission from the parents. And as far as I can tell, without informing them of any results. And these are just quotes from a news stories. The moms are saying, you're a sleepless mom. The burden's on you to try to get out of this. And what about getting out of these things? Well, I was on a panel recently with a police chief who is using rapid DNA. They go to a crime scene with a machine. It's the officers who do the DNA. And they might ask everybody in this room to give DNA because there was a crime here. And you give your DNA. And then they tell you, you can call at any time and take your DNA out of our database. And so I raised my hand and I asked the police chief, How many people have done that? Who's going to call the police and say, I want to be the one guy who gets his DNA out of your system? Again, these ideas of consent and withdrawal are really not practical. Okay. Can you re-identify the de-identified? Oh, my God. I'm a geneticist. It's DNA, stupid. It is the ultimate identification. Your name is not as good as your DNA. How do I know this? Because there was a paper in 2018 where they inferred familial relationships in order to study inherited disease from available data that they got from this hospital sharing consortium. They didn't use any of the HIPAA strikes. They used something that isn't stricken, which is the emergency contact phone numbers. And so they reconstructed, I don't know how many thousands and thousands of records by looking at what number people left as their emergency contact, pairing that up with other numbers, and deducing from that, to a high degree of statistical significance, family relationships. We cannot identify these. We are using this now. I'm taking advantage of it where I can in public databases to do genealogical searches to identify perpetrators of crime. What's the way out of this? Well, and I didn't realize Dawn was from Luna. I came in late, I tried to find her during the break. But I thought this was a great idea. In fact, it was an idea that myself and a colleague had. We submitted to NSF in 2016, I mentioned earlier today. And the idea is a blockchain where you have a public and a private code, and your private code gives you access to any research you've done with your results. And I'll just end with that, saying that we constructed such a program. It is feasible to do, but we need a lot of money to do it, just like anybody. But there's no reason you cannot assign a blockchain code, private key, to people when they donate their DNA. They lose it, it's their trouble. But they can then find out where their products have been used, and they can withdraw. We need a bank, a biobank. That includes interest. That includes accountability, allows you to withdraw as well as deposit. So anybody who's designing these computer programs, why don't we start with the consumer interface? I can track my packages. I can track a prom dress that's being made over the internet with a secret code. I can't find out what's happened to my DNA. Thanks very much. Oh, I got my junk here.
Since we have a panel later on, we're going to save most of the questions for then. If we have time for maybe one or two clarifying, we might do that. So our next speaker is Christy Guarini from the Baylor College of Medicine Center for Medical Ethics and Health Policy. And she is a lawyer, so she might know some of the things that people have been asking.
Hi, good afternoon. So yes, I am from Baylor College of Medicine Center for Medical Ethics and Health Policy. And I've been looking forward to talking with you all about how my work on citizen science intersects with the broader topic of this symposium, patient control of genomic data. So I'll begin by orienting that topic within the citizen science landscape. So pretty much anytime I talk about my work, the first question I get is, what is citizen science? And that's a fair question because citizen science is kind of a squishy term. There's no real consensus on the definition, but usually it's defined broadly to encompass any activity that has a genuine scientific outcome that involves the public in a meaningful way. So research efforts that involve the public in collecting and analyzing data qualify as citizen science. We see these projects often in the environmental sciences. But also, citizen science covers projects that are designed and executed entirely by the public. So in the biomedical sciences, when groups of individuals are sort of intensively collecting their biometric data and sharing them with one another to glean health insights, we say that counts as citizen science too. There are citizen science projects in many different disciplines, and within each discipline, it takes many different forms. But just focusing on the biomedical sciences, we often hear citizen science used to refer to really diverse but sometimes overlapping activities or research approaches or even movements from patient-driven research all the way to biohacking. Now, one common objective among some of these activities is what I think of as genetic empowerment, and by that I'm referring to empowering individuals to understand and extract value from their genetic data. Now, to take a step back, we know genetic empowerment is big business. There are many services, tools, and platforms that are now available directly to individuals that are animated by this idea. Genetic empowerment is, in fact, what's driving the very successful direct-to-consumer genetic testing industry. I recently heard that it was estimated that 26 million people by now have taken one of these tests. Now, the risks and benefits of DTC genetic testing are already the subject of a vast and very thoughtful literature. I will not dwell on it here. Instead, I want to focus on a new breed of genetic empowerment tools that was actually mentioned at the very beginning of the symposium. And these are third-party interpretation tools. These are bioinformatics tools that interpret a person's raw DNA for any number of purposes, including health purposes. So what do I mean by raw DNA? I mean the A's, T's, C's, and G's that make up our genomes. But I like to use concrete examples. So I'm showing you here the beginning of a text file of my raw DNA that I downloaded from 23andMe after being tested by the company. Now, my full text file consists of about 601,000 SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms, and I'm showing you just 2 of them here. I have blacked out some information here and later on for obvious privacy reasons. So how do you get a hold of your raw data? Well, it's not just from 23andMe. At this point, every major DTC genetic testing firm is offering their customers the option of downloading their raw DNA, and they usually make it really easy. It's often just a matter of going to your personal webpage and clicking that download link. This is exactly what it looks like for me on my 23andMe webpage. But some research studies are also offering participants the raw DNA as a matter of course. And then individuals can request their raw DNA from clinical testing labs, and as Devin McGraw explained, they are legally obligated to honor those requests, and that's because of HIPAA, because HIPAA provides everyone a right of access to their protected health information, and the Office of Civil Rights has indicated that raw DNA does qualify as protected health information. But raw DNA, considered alone, is not very interesting. In order to extract meaning from those data, they need to be interpreted, and that is the job of these third-party interpretation tools. So a couple of years ago, some researchers at the University of Washington set out to characterize this landscape, and they ended up identifying and describing 23 third-party interpretation tools. They found that the information generated by these tools is incredibly diverse and ranges from ancestry composition to genetic relative finders to disease predisposition information. But let's look at some examples. So I want to start with GEDmatch. GEDmatch was actually the site that was used to identify the Golden State Killer suspect about 18 months ago. It is a website that offers tools that users can use to identify genetic relatives. And I'll just pause here and say, I know we're talking about health, but those University of Washington researchers did find that often ancestry sites can be used as gateways. So if someone has a good experience with one of these sites, then they might look to other tools to see what other information they might be able to glean from those data. And then also, some individuals are looking for their genetic relatives in order to help understand their health issues. So when I upload my SNP file to GEDmatch, it generates for me a list of potential relative matches, and each row here indicates a potential relative, with my closest match at the very top. Now, I can use other tools to approximate my relationships to each of these people, but I also can just email them. And that's because GEDmatch requires, as a condition of registering for the site, that you provide an email address. So maybe we can figure out among ourselves how we might be related. Now, in the health arena, there's a tool called Promethease, which generates reports that describe the health or trait implications of users' SNPs. So this is the beginning of my Promethease report. The first SNP identifies me as genetically female. The second SNP characterizes my risk for atrial fibrillation based on that one SNP. Now, my full report is probably thousands of pages long, and that's because the results are presented SNP by SNP. I can tell you that there's quite a bit of cancer risk information in this report. Now, Promethease also characterizes some of these SNPs as good, bad, or not set. So you can see my second SNP here was designated green, which means good. And Promethease will also generate a pie chart that visualizes a person's entire SNP profile according to these designations. Okay, so both GEDmatch and Promethease are offered for free. And I want to emphasize they're not fringy. They're actually pretty mainstream. So GEDmatch now has over 1 million participants, and it is considered the go-to site for genetic genealogy. It's less clear how many people are using Promethease, but about 3 weeks ago it was acquired by a major DTC genetic testing firm, which claims that the database consists of hundreds of thousands of SNP profiles. So why are these tools so popular? It's because they can generate potentially useful or at least kind of interesting information. So this table categorizes the reasons why people are using these tools according to potential benefits. So they might learn information that helps them understand their identity, that might inform relationships, that might help them understand their health issues or family members' health issues. These sites can provide personal learning as well as advanced science when the data are used for research purposes. And then finally, just enjoyment, because a number of users report that these tools are just fun. But there are a number of risks, and I'm sure you've been thinking of some as I've been talking. Let's start with safety. So if the data that are being interpreted are inaccurate, there are obvious problems down the road. So recently, some researchers at Ambry Genetics, which is a clinical lab, reviewed the files of 49 patients who had received DTC genetic tests and had been referred to the lab for confirmatory testing. These researchers found that 40% were false positives, so they could not confirm 40% of the reported variants. Even when the data are correct, though, they could be misinterpreted. So the same researchers found discrepancies in the interpretation of 8 variants in 5 reported genes. And even when the data are correct and the interpretations are correct, they still might be reported in a way that causes confusion for users or their clinicians. That can especially be the case when confusing graphics or color coding are used. So in a recent study with genetic counselors who had counseled patients about their results from these kinds of tools, the genetic counselors noted that this was really an issue, this confusion. Now, when there are inaccuracies, when there is confusion, some bad things can happen. And we're hearing a little bit about it now in case studies. People can become distressed. They may unnecessarily change their health behaviors. They may make potentially harmful healthcare decisions, and they might utilize certain scarce resources, we might say unnecessarily. And there are privacy risks. That has been a frequent topic of discussion today. So some of these tools may not have adequate privacy policies or maybe privacy policies at all. So some researchers at Vanderbilt recently reviewed the privacy policies of 90 DTC genetic testing companies and third-party interpretation tools and found that 35, so 40% of these companies had no policies posted whatsoever about how they were using, sharing, or storing the genetic data that they were collecting. Now, in addition to poor privacy policies, there just may be insufficient security practices that might lead to accidental disclosure or unauthorized access. And then something I'm personally worried about is what happens to these data when the company folds, when it goes bankrupt, or when it merges. When genetic data get into the wrong hands, they might be publicly disclosed, which can embarrass individuals. Those data could be used for blackmail purposes or to discriminate. And then finally, as you just heard, law enforcement is searching some of these data for criminal investigation purposes. Now, my colleagues and I are doing some work around investigative genetic genealogy, but in the interest of time, I'll save any remarks for the panel if that's of interest. So what laws are in place to protect against these risks? Well, recently my colleagues and I examined this regulatory landscape, and we concluded that two agencies have relevant, although limited, authority. So the FDA to protect against safety risks and the FTC to protect against privacy risks. However, there are lingering questions about the scope of these authorities, and we believe that the public would benefit from clarification, for instance, in the form of formal guidance. So I leaned on a number of studies to prepare this talk. I do want to acknowledge them, as well as my wonderful collaborators in this space and NHGRI for funding support. Thank you so much.
Hi, Christy. So I think you kind of touched one of my nerves because it's a couple of comments I wanted to say with regards to these algorithms, third-party algorithms, as you described. I'm
having a hard time just hearing.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's a little better. Thank you.
So my first concern with these kind of algorithms is, again, that we're calling them citizen science, but actually they are not citizen science when you go into the realm of cancer risk, because that kind of crosses in my mind it can have consequences in terms of how you manage your health, etc. The second issue that I find with these algorithms is a lack of accountability in the accuracy of the results that they're able to provide. I've done Prometheus myself, and I've used many others of these algorithms. And I think that one of the big problems is the fact that you cannot really track the validity of the results that they're providing, because there's no sort of way in which they are accountable. There are no kind of standards to which they can sort of say these how accurate they are in their predictions. I just wanted to say these two comments.
Yeah. No, thank you. And thank you for that point. As far as the first point, there is a raging debate about, what citizen science means and when it's appropriate to use that term. Your first point is also well taken. I tend to go with the very broad and inclusive definition, because that is also sort of consistent with the ethos of citizen science, is to let individual initiatives self-identify as citizen science if they so choose. And so I want to respect that self-selection.
All right, so we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back about 3:45, so a little bit under 15 minutes.
All right, so hopefully we've got everybody back. Everybody got a chance to go to the restroom. So our next speaker is actually going to be another virtual speaker. This is Richard Milne from the Welcome Genome Campus. He'll be speaking about Your DNA, Your Say. All right. Let me try this again. Our next speaker will be Richard Milne from the Welcome Genome Campus. He'll be speaking about Your DNA, Your Say, which is a big international project on data sharing. Richard, can you hear us?
I can hear you, yes. Can you hear me?
Perfect, we can hear you. All right.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. Well, yeah, thanks for the introduction, and I'd just like to thank the organisers before I start for the invitation to speak and for all the work that's gone into setting up what's been a great meeting. I've been following as much as I can online. So, I'm a sociologist based in the Society and Ethics Research Group at the Welcome Genome Campus in Cambridge in the UK, so at the Sanger Institute, where we do a lot of gene sequencing, but we also do work around empirical research around some of the social and ethical challenges associated with genomics, particularly around data and around the clinical implementation of genomic medicine. And so this afternoon, I'm going to talk through some of the work our group's been doing over the last couple of years around genomic data, focusing on public perceptions of data sharing and really particularly focusing on the question of trust. And fundamentally, that kind of question of who is it that we trust with our genomic and health data. And I'm going to discuss some of our recently published work in this area and a couple of pieces of unpublished data from the global Your DNA, Your Say survey. And hopefully I think that this talk will expand on some of the themes you've been hearing about throughout the day and that we've been talking about people's motivations for sharing data and how we make data platforms trustworthy. Could you just move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So as I'm sure everybody's aware, and as we've heard earlier in the day, the quantity of genomic data that's being generated is expanding rapidly across public, private, and clinical settings. Some of these data are generated in hospitals, others within personal genetics companies, and yet more in this wave of global government initiatives that are shown here. And so work from the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health estimates that 60 million people may have had their genome sequenced within the next 5 years globally, with an additional 100 million coming from China alone by the year 2030. And a major part of the promise of these initiatives also lies in the ability to conduct analyses across them. So precision medicine initiatives, whether the Cancer Moonshot or the Chinese initiative, require data sharing, whether to aid variant interpretation or to support the research with large, diverse data sets. So close to home for me, the EU is in the process of building the Million European Genomes Alliance, or MEGA, which aims to bring together genomic and health data of at least 1 million people across 20 European countries by 2022. And at the moment, that includes the UK, although probably, as you're aware, the less said about the UK's relationship with Europe, the better at this point. And could you just move to the next slide, please? So the collection and sharing of genomic and health data at this kind of scale, and particularly but not exclusively within government-led initiatives, needs the buy-in of patients and the public. And it's the congruence between the structure and goals of data initiatives and the hopes and concerns of patients and the public that establishes their social license to operate. And where these diverge and it isn't clear that the collection and sharing of data serves the public interest, for example, in England's failed care.data programme, support may be withheld and the legitimacy and success of projects can be undermined. So if we want to understand how the collection and sharing of genomic data should occur in a particular country or what donors of data can or want to contribute, we need to do so through, understand this through kind of empirical social science research that examines people's values and experiences. And one key area of study that lies at the heart of this relationship between members of the public and patients as donors of genomic data and those who are collecting, sharing, or curating these data is this question of trust. Who is it that we trust with our data in an era when data scandals are increasingly common? And I think we heard one of those in one of the talks just before around BRCA. And even with further than that, what is it that we mean by when we're talking about trust? And from my perspective, in general, trust can be understood as a heuristic. It's a rule of thumb that allows us to act when we are faced with unknown future events, with future unknowns. It's informed by our existing relationships and our familiarity with the people and organizations we're interacting with. And at the end of the day, it also involves a leap of faith as we commit ourselves to acting in the absence of certain knowledge. So in the case of genomic data, this involves individuals placing their faith in the motivations and the ability of researchers to realize the benefits and mitigate the risks that are associated with donating and sharing their data, whether that's data collected as part of one of these initiatives, government initiative-led initiatives, or whether it's data that's requested, held, and then shared by individuals themselves, based drawing on their rights under HIPAA or in Europe under GDPR. So next slide, please. So in our group, we've set out to study how people perceive the donation and sharing of genomic data and whom they trust with their data. So Your DNA, Your online survey that uses a series of videos to inform and engage people with questions related to genomic data. The study was started by Anna Middleton, who leads the Society and Ethics Research Group here at the Wellcome. And it started in the UK, USA, Canada, Australia, France, Poland, and Sweden. And over the last couple of years, we've built this incredible network of collaborators, which has now enabled us to collect this kind of standardized data from representative public samples across 22 different countries and 14 languages. And we now have about, so it says 33,000, it's about 37,000 now, because we've just completed data collection in China, and we're getting data in from Ghana, Iceland, and Qatar in the near future. So next slide, please. So we've really, the global data collection has only just finished, and we've only just started analysis, and it's already starting to just give us some insight into these kind of patterns of global patterns of people's willingness to donate their data, people's trust, and I'll come back to that later. But here, for example, this is a map of showing people's willingness to donate for non-profit research, willingness to donate their DNA and health information for non-profit research. And what you see is some variation across the globe, from very high in some South American countries to lower in countries like India, but kind of averaging out about half of people globally seem to be willing to donate their data, their DNA and health data for non-profit research. But if you could just move to the next slide, please. So while this global data has been coming in, we've been doing some deeper analyses of the first set of data that we collected, which was from North America, the UK, and Australia. And here I really want to focus on the work we've done on patterns of trust in the different individuals and groups working with genomic data. And in this case, rather than looking to compare across countries, we've focused on what it is that we can say about how trust is distributed across the population, what differences there might be in how as well as whom people trust, working with a data set combined from these four sites. And much of the work that I'm going to summarize in the next few slides is drawn from a paper that was published last week in Human Genetics in a very nice and timely fashion and ready for the symposium. Next slide, please. So just to provide some context, our analysis in the paper draws on a series of questions asking people about their trust in different groups involved in DNA, in collecting and sharing DNA and health data, and how these relate with a series of variables related to people's existing or familiarity with genomics, whether that was based on a kind of general scientific interest or based on personal experience of using clinical genetic services or working in genetic services, people's willingness to donate, people's previous experience of having negative experiences with data, their concerns about particular areas of harm, their views on regulation and legislation, and then a range of socio-demographic characteristics. So next slide, please. So overall, our research confirms much of what you might expect based on what we know from previous research, that overall people trust their own doctor most when it comes to their DNA or health information. And this level of trust then shelves off as you start thinking about other doctors, even within the same country, thinking about non-profit researchers in universities or thinking about company researchers, and then governments faring little better than companies on the right-hand side of this slide. And what these results re-emphasize is the fact that when we're thinking about who do we trust with our data, this trust is not placed equally. and that personal doctors continue to play an important gatekeeping role in the context of research and data donation. Next slide, please. So what we did then was we moved on to explore the characteristics of trust in more detail in our study population. One of the first findings that's of particular interest was the subgroup analysis. So what we did was we ran an analysis called a latent class analysis to identify groups with who had distinct patterns of response across distinct and consistent patterns of response across the different trust variables. And what we found was that the statistical model that had the best fit to our data identified 3 different classes, which we have described as low, variable, and high trust groups. These groups display these clear and consistent patterns across the different questions. So for the high trust group, for example, display higher levels of trust across the board, with little difference between doctors and non-profit researchers, and they have a much higher probability of trusting company researchers. However, they were also the smallest group among our respondents. Their counterparts in the low trust group were more numerous and showed little trust in anyone other than their own doctor, and even then at a much lower level than those in the other groups. And then this final variable trust group mirror the overall pattern seen in the data described in the previous slide. So trust drops off across the different groups we considered. And what these findings might suggest is that this group are those who are making the most active discriminations between the different categories, and that the other 2 groups are displaying a more blanket trust or distrust. And these are differences that are potentially important in thinking about what trust is. So whether we're comparing somebody's kind of critical assessment of the people that they're thinking about giving their data to, or whether we're thinking about a systemic confidence or lack of confidence. And that then affects, I think, how we approach the question of making a genomic data system trustworthy, framing what it is we do. Next slide, please. When we look at the characteristics associated with membership of these subgroups, so particularly focusing on the high trust group here, we find that men, those people with children, those people with personal experience of genetics, and within our data set, those people from the USA, were more likely to be members of the high trust group. Those in the variable trust group we found were more likely to be from the UK. People who were over 50 and who had lower levels of education were less likely to be in the high trust group. Next slide, please. Could you just click through? Sorry. So we then ran a regression analysis looking at the odds of associated with different variables with these different trust groups. And we found that the high trust group had a much higher likelihood, as you might expect, of being willing to donate their DNA and health data. They were also much less likely to be concerned about the misuse of their data, whether that's by governments, police, insurance, or marketers. Membership of the low trust group, in contrast, was associated with concern about police and government uses of health and genomic data. And people in the variable trust group were also concerned about the use of data for marketing and insurance, and that perhaps reflects their lower trust in companies. One of the findings that was interesting, though, was that being a member of the high trust group was also associated with having had a negative experience of data access. And so here you have this population who both potentially have experience of something having happened with their data, and also have lower levels of concerns about misuse of data in the future. And so that this kind of concerns about data harms may be less salient for this group in shaping their levels of trust. We also found that members of the low trust group had lower odds of being reassured by potential legal protection, which is a finding that's perhaps understandable given their lower trust in government, but then makes one think again about who is it that is reassured once we introduce regulation and legislation. Next slide, please. So could you just click again? So thank you. So then just going back to this is preliminary results from our ongoing meta-analysis, and really what I wanted to show is that some of these same patterns are falling out in very similar ways across our sample. So we have this very strong trust in people's own doctors, in terms of their ability, in terms of that people's willingness to trust those individuals with their DNA and health data, and a much lower trust in company researchers, which is replicated in almost every country. Other organisations, so whether that's doctors, non-profit researchers, and governments, are showing some interesting variation. And we're also finding across the sample this consistent relationship between people's trust and people's willingness to donate. But what's interesting as we're starting to analyze this is the kind of ways in which some of these countries are diverging and contrasting. And yeah, hopefully we'll have some of those results out for with a more detailed analysis by the end of the year. But what I want to do, just if you move to the next slide, is just to move towards some conclusions from the work that we've done so far. And so I think some of the findings that we've published in this paper and in previous work and work that other people have done show that this kind of familiarity with genetics and health services, the people who are most familiar are those who are most willing to donate and share their data. And I think you hear that in the enthusiasm of patient advocacy groups, patient organizations around data sharing. We've found that trust is very strongly related to donation, but also that there are important potential differences in how trust is given or withheld, and the possible differences between this kind of idea of trust in a system versus a kind of critical and discriminatory type of trust. And we talk a lot in forums like this about building trustworthy platforms for genomic data collection and sharing. And so one hope is that our study is providing some empirical basis for considering the diverse ways trust is given and how that varies around the globe. And I think as genomic data sharing kind of moves from something that's focused primarily on research to becoming this bigger societal and clinical endeavor, and as we talk about the potential for personal access to and control over genomic data, our findings suggest this need to kind of continually consider which public we're talking about and which public we're engaging with. Members of the public involved in research are likely to be those who are most trusting of researchers and clinicians. But as genomic data collection expands, those who are more skeptical will inevitably be drawn into contact with genomic data sharing, if only through a family member. So I think our final conclusion is that in these kind of circumstances, it's valuable to recognize the kind of connections between the diversity of trust, the limits of policy and legislative action in reinforcing trust, and how the genomics community can think about engaging with both opposition and ambivalence in building approaches to data collection, sharing, and use. And over the next few months, we're starting to look across the globe to examine how these patterns of trust fit with what we already know and what we might find out. So just to finish, if you just go to the next slide, please. There are a huge number of people involved in the Your DNA, Your Say study, not least the people who've translated and collaborated on it, and Anna Middleton, who leads the project. And so I'd just like to thank you again for listening and answer any questions at this time. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Richard. And I think we had one question from online, and I'd like to take that out of respect for the people who are, like Richard, calling from remote.
So the question was, what is the risk of developing technologies of increasing sophistication, for example, intelligence and machine learning, in regards to privacy and security of genomic data and its sharing?
Thanks. I mean, it's a great question. I think one of the things that we're seeing, and I think that you hear through the other talks as well, is that as we get better as we collect more data and as we get better at analyzing that data and doing interesting new things with data put into different combinations, that inevitably we run up against this kind of challenge of what is it that how do you ensure privacy, how do you ensure security? And I think I think Greg's talk, was it before, when he was talking about proposing kind of systems like blockchain, and the Lunar DNA talk as well. I mean, there are people working very kind of closely on how you put in place systems, both technical and social, to protect privacy, protect and secure data. So.
All right, so thank you so much, Richard, and thank you for joining us, even though it's past 9 o'clock your time, so we really appreciate it.
It's absolutely my pleasure. Thank you very much.
So our next speaker, unfortunately, Michelle McGowan couldn't join us today, so we're just going to move on to our last speaker for the day before we do our panel. Our next speaker is Robert Cook-Deegan from the Arizona State University, the School for the Future of Innovation in Society, which is an exciting name.
So the first thing to say is thank you, Sean, thank you, Charlize, for paying attention to this issue. Real credit to NIH, to NCI for bringing attention to a regularly neglected aspect of the data structures that we're trying to construct. I'll explain the name of the title, and it'll flow naturally out of the talk, but before I get started, I go to a lot of weddings, but the best wedding toast I've ever heard was at my son and daughter-in-law's wedding a year ago, December, when a Colorado-born oilman who is a Trump Republican gave a toast to my son and daughter-in-law, having gone to a Zen ceremony in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And he toasted to Obama for bringing the two of them together. I mention that because he died 2 weeks ago of a BRCA-related cancer. And the ceremony for him, excuse me, give me a second to let that wash over. The ceremony for him will take place on Saturday in Denver, Colorado. So this is dedicated to him. So the story starts, there's a prequel to one of the horror stories that you heard today, which was told by KJ or Carl, about a group of folks who had just gotten together. There's a prequel to his story. We had a workshop in Santa Cruz, California, which is kind of the hotbed of bioinformatics. It was the place where the genome assembly was done for the Human Genome Project in a flurry in the spring of the year 2000. And it's become one of the places where computer geeks deal with genomic information. And we were trying to get the people who were in the technical community together with the people who are concerned about the mutations in their bodies. And the place to start, if you're thinking about that kind of an issue, is BRCA1 and 2, because these two genes were discovered in 1994 and 1995. The linkage was done by Mary Claire King in 1990, telling us that there were genes to be found. So we have had almost 3 decades of experience dealing with two of the most studied genes in the human genome. And the story I'm going to be talking about confronts two problems, and we have to solve both of these problems simultaneously. One problem is we learned that the incredible work that these online social networks were doing was actually being done at the whim and on a platform that the users perceived to be free, but in fact was making its money by selling access to data, and there were no protections to that group, and being shut down would be at the whim of a corporation. So that's a vulnerability that suddenly took all of the attention and sucked all the oxygen out of the room after March of the year that we had that workshop. So we had the workshop in February. Cambridge Analytica happens in March. The groups discover the vulnerability in the ensuing weeks, and that's the story that KJ told us earlier today. So one problem is let's find a safe space to do the valuable work that online support groups do, because they are inevitably and essentially sharing lots of private information about their mutations, pictures of their pre- and post-surgery. This is highly, highly private information. And it was a horrible revelation to realize that anybody with an app could go in and scrape it all. So that's problem number one. Problem number two, however, is the main one that I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to take you back to the story that's portrayed here, and you saw a slide like this from KJ earlier. This is April, May, and June of 2013. In April, you see Eric Lander and me high-fiving. You see Jim Watson, Francis Collins talking to Eric Lander over here. And then you see 10 of us nerds from Duke who had gone to the Supreme Court to hear the oral arguments on tax day in the year 2013. A month later, Angelina Jolie says, I just had both of my breasts removed because I have a BRCA mutation. And she has a history of cancer, ovarian and breast cancer in her family. And then, in June, in the middle, you see pigs fly. Why pigs fly? Well, that was the headline when the Supreme Court, in a 9-0 unanimous decision, said you cannot patent a DNA sequence that would be found in nature. If you've modified it, engineered it, yes, you can patent it, but you cannot patent a DNA sequence that would be found in nature. What that means is that suddenly the genome opened up. And lots of other things were happening at the same time. The coding scheme for how you get paid to do a genetic test was changing at the same time. The myriad cases decided in June, and by noon that day, the decision was announced at about 10:20 in the morning by Justice Clarence Thomas. And by noon that day, 2 labs had said, hey, we're going to start offering BRCA testing. So new labs entered the provision of BRCA testing in the United States. By the end of 2013, there were more than a dozen labs. So new labs are entering the space. That same year, the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health that was realizing we need to have standards and technologies and geeks talking to each other about how to make this information useful. We need some infrastructure and standards. And moreover, the National Library of Medicine here at NIH said, hey, let's create a database that is specifically intended for use by people trying to figure out what is the clinical meaning of these variants that we're going to be discovering in the human genome over the next 30 or 40 years or the next century. Let's get that information out for people and in a database that is designed for that particular use, as opposed to the various scientific databases that had been collected around different genes all over the human genome. And then finally, there was a partnership. There was this pre-existing groups of individuals for different genes about how to interpret those variants. That began to get consolidated under a grants program that was called ClinGen, NIH grants. And the same thing is going on all over the world. Specifically with respect to BRCA1 and 2, there was a long-standing group called Enigma. The Enigma stands for genome mutation alleles, germline mutation alleles. So it was a group for interpreting germline mutation mutant alleles in the human genome. So it was BRCA1 and 2. That group existed for over a decade before this happened, but it got pulled into a much more systematic framework in 2013. You saw this slide from Carl, but I want to bring to your attention a couple features. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide. These are the 5 databases that had data on these 2 genes all over the world that are publicly available. And what I want you to notice is you'll see in the middle the place where there's intersection of all these databases. Those variations, those 123 mutations, a snapshot that was taken in 2016 in a paper. Those are things like the Ashkenazi founder mutations and the things that were quickly discovered once we knew where to look in the genome for these 2 genes on chromosome 17 and 13. Those are the common mutations. Most people sending a test to a clinical lab will get either a result, you don't have any variants, or you have one of these common variants, and those are in the middle. But notice the big numbers here. You'll notice the big numbers at ClinVar, at BRCA Share, Enigma, Lovid, and Arup are out in the outer lobe. Those are variants that are only detected in that one database. What's the problem? The problem is these are very rare variants, and when you test in a new population, you're likely to come across variants that haven't been discovered before. and you're not going to know how to interpret them. What's the problem? People are making decisions about having their breasts removed, their ovaries removed, decisions about cancer care. This is as high stakes as it gets. Highly private, high stakes clinical decisions, and yet, look at this. Unless you had access to every one of these databases, you could be missing really important information. So, what do we have here? We have a data sharing problem. And in order to make good clinical interpretations, we want our patients to have the best information anywhere in the world about the mutation that they might find in their body. So that's point number one. These are the public databases. Most important about this slide is what's not on it. The largest database in the world is at Myriad Genetics. They've done more than 2 million tests. They do not share their data. They stopped sharing their data with NIH in November of 2004. It's absurd. Why do we tolerate that? We're paying for that under a clinical system that says, give us samples of your body, we'll give you back the information about your risk, but we're going to keep it as a trade secret. That's an absurd business model that has been allowed to proliferate under our system. And it's not just Myriad. There are other companies that are doing the same thing. But what else is missing? We do not have the data from the National Health System of the UK. We do not have data from the largest laboratories in Germany. These are OECD countries with really good health systems. The data are not flowing into the public databases. Why? Well, because we don't have a system for doing that. We haven't built the structures, the infrastructure, the standards that enable that. And sometimes it's the laws that have been passed in nations. So under negotiation right now is how do we get the data from the National Health Service? They would like to share it. They would like to move it into the database that I'll mention in a minute that's located at UC Santa Cruz. But their lawyers, well, we have this privacy law, and we're in the middle of Brexit, and my gosh, we can't share the data. Which is, again, really absurd if you think about it, because in ClinVar we do not have information about individual patients. We have the variant. We have what we know about the variant. That is not private information. That's as public as it gets. But we've got an obstacle to overcome before we can get that relevant data into the data structures that we care about. Carl also showed this slide. And it's a little misleading, but let me just point out that the green bar is the mutations that have been identified in the human genome that we know are disease-associated, and there's good evidence for it. But look at the big orange thing. Those are the cases where we don't have enough information, or they just haven't gone through the system yet. And going back to this slide, please look at the top. We have 6,000 variants reported in the BRCA exchange. That's the database that I was alluding to at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And those of you who went to Amy's poster over lunch, you saw the data that they're pulling together. It is not a database per se. It is a construction. It's a resource that reaches out to the other data structures all over the world to pool the information that would be relevant to its users. We have 26,000 variants that are in that database now, that are available through that database now, of which fewer than 5,000 are pathogenic. Most of the rest are probably not going to be pathogenic. We're pretty sure about that. But we have a really serious problem in figuring that out because we have not built the structures for doing it. So this is some of the groups that are trying to do the work of pooling this data into a commons based on the work of, in part, of this woman. She got the Nobel Prize for Economics for addressing one problem. You may remember Garrett Hardin wrote this article in the 860s. It's 50 years old this year. It was published in Science. He was the president of the AAAS one year. He gave his presidential address and he said, "We've got a tragedy. You can have a tragedy of the commons. You have fisheries, or you have a field where multiple farmers want to graze, and everybody has an incentive to overuse the natural resource, in which case it will be depleted unless you have something stopping that process. You can't leave it to the market, because market forces don't work. It's a case where market failure happens. And what are the solutions? Well, if the market fails, then you have government. You have the behemoth. You have the Leviathan that comes in and sets the rules. This is kind of a despairing thing, and he called it the tragedy of the commons, and indeed it would be a tragedy. Eleanor Ostrom spent her whole career saying, not so fast. We're smart. We're people. We have brains, and we talk to each other. We can set up rules that allow us not to deplete a resource if we talk to each other, we develop a community that has common interests, and we begin to respect rules. Brilliant idea. That's the idea of a commons. Export that idea of constructing a commons and now move it into a data space. What's different about data? Everybody can use them without depleting the resource. So the same rules are not going to be the same for data as they have been for depletable natural resources. And a bunch of scholars are thinking about, how do we do this? What are the rules? So we are focusing a particular project on how do we do this for genes that are associated with the inherited risk of cancer. And we're starting with BRCA1 and 2 because that's where the action has been, that's where the resources are, and that's where the activated constituency groups are. There's probably no more potent political constituency among disease groups than breast cancer. And why are we calling it the Spirit of Bermuda and the Sulston Project? Well, here you have 50 people who met in February of 1996 to set up the rules as the Human Genome Project was starting to get launched and move into the sequencing phase. This gave rise to the reference genome that was published in 2000 in draft form and kind of finished in 2003-2004. At the bottom you see Fred Sanger, for whom the Sanger Institute is named, and on the right you see John Sulston, who was the head of the Human Genome Project that was funded by the Wellcome Trust to do the Human Genome Project. Here is something that he wrote on the blackboard, or the whiteboard I should say, in Bermuda in February of 1996. And this is the rule that said, when you are being paid by the Wellcome Trust or NIH or another element of the Public Genome Project, and you sequence data today, you will post the data on the web by the end of the day. It was daily deposit of data well before publication. It was really controversial at the time, but this is actually a remarkable moment in the history of science. And of the landmarks of open science. Now the problem is he was exporting this model from nematode genetics, and there aren't a lot of nematodes that get cancer and go to Memorial Sloan Kettering to get treatment. So the money wasn't there, the complications of medical treatment were not there, and so back to these two problems that we have to solve. We have to solve the problem of safe, secure, and private use of information, and at the same time, we have to find a way to share the data that's relevant for clinical decision making by building the rules and the infrastructure that enables us to do that. And we're going to do that via policy. And I want to go back to Steve. Here's a Trump Republican toasting to Senator Obama, then President Obama. And it turns out Republicans and Democrats are both against cancer. So I think we can solve this problem, and I think we can solve both problems simultaneously, and we're going to have to do that through the political system that we have. I'll just notice that the work that's being done on cancer genes grew out of two previous projects. One project was focused on the influx of new genomic information into the clinical system, next generation sequencing. And when we did that, we found out that the highest importance and the least likelihood of being fixed was data sharing. So when we got that result, we decided to do another project about how do we build a commons. That project was about 3/4 of the way through when we started the project that is now being known as the Sulston Project. And in honor of John Sulston, who died last March, just as we were writing the proposal for this project, we would like to build the infrastructure. We have optimism that we can solve both of these problems simultaneously by generating data structures that are safe and secure, also allow us to make the best scientific and clinical inferences that we can. Thank you.